Alright guys, welcome to part 8 in my Atlantis video series. This one is going to be on the readings of Edgar Cayce, and what he says about the timeline of Atlantis and its various destructions. So just a little heads up, Edgar Cayce is supposedly a psychic medium from the early 1900s who would give past life readings to people, and a lot of these past life readings would bring up the concept of Atlantis. And also, he was a devout Christian, so that bias may influence some of his readings. But also, he was in a trance state when he gives the readings, hence the name, the sleeping prophet. So a lot of the wording in these readings themselves is a bit strange and ambiguous. So just be aware of that going into it. So in one reading, he says, "The position as the continent Atlantis occupied is that as between the Gulf of Mexico on the one hand and the Mediterranean upon the other. Evidences of this lost civilization are to be found in the Pyrenees and Morocco on the one hand, British Honduras, Yucatan, and America upon the other. There are some protruding portions within this that must have at one time or another been a portion of this great continent. The British West Indies or the Bahamas, and a portion of same that may be seen in the present, if the geological survey would be made in some of these, especially or notably in Bimini and in the Gulf Stream through this vicinity, these may even yet be determined." So, this last part, people have taken this to mean that Edgar Cayce predicted the discovery of the Bimini Road, which is a feature that people argue whether it is natural or artificial, man-made or geological. And Graham Hancock's show on Netflix talks about this. Based on a lot of the evidence he presents and the footage he shows, I would tend to lean more toward the idea that these are man-made, right? The Bimini Road is man-made. And therefore, it must have been constructed at some time when it was above the water. Potentially sometime in the Pleistocene or early Holocene. So people have taken this passage as meaning that Edgar Cayce is predicting the discovery of the Bimini Road and that he's associating it with Atlantis, right? So this might be a point in favor of his predictive abilities, perhaps, if you agree with that interpretation. He's also mentioning the position is between the Mediterranean on one hand and the Gulf of Mexico on the other, toward the Yucatan, the Pyrenees, and Morocco. And this lines up very, very nicely with what we said in our location video about the Azores Plateau and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge being this large island of Atlantis at one point, which has since sunk. So he seems to be corroborating what we're saying about the location as well. Edgar Cayce also mentions dates for 3 different destructions of Atlantis. The last one, he's saying, is nearly 10,000 years before the Prince of Peace, a.k.a. Jesus. Again, this guy's a very devout Christian. So, nearly 10,000 BC is the time of the third destruction. And this lines up with Plato's date of 9600 BC. That's nearly 10,000 years before Jesus, right? So that fits perfectly. Okay. Then for the second destruction, Edgar Cayce appears to give 2 different dates. So it may have been a prolonged episode of cataclysms or catastrophes. But he's saying 10,700 years before Jesus, and also 10,600 years before Jesus. We find a civilization being disturbed by corruption from within to such measures that the elements join in bringing devastation to a stiff-necked and adulterous people. With the second and third upheavals in Atlantis, there were individuals who left those lands and came to this particular portion then visible. So it sounds like with the second and third destructions, he's saying that refugees came to the Americas. That's how I would interpret that. And with the 10,700 BC date, he's saying there was a wasting away into the mountains, the valleys, the sea itself, and a fast disintegration of the lands as well as of the peoples, save those that had escaped into distant lands. In this other reading, he's asked point blank what was the date of the first destruction of Atlantis, and he says 7,500 years before the final destruction, which he gave as, almost 10,000 BC. Now, what's interesting is all three of these dates, 9,600 BC, right, which is nearly 10,000 years, the date given by Plato for the destruction of Atlantis, and the date given by Cayce for the third and final destruction. The second destruction, 10,700 to 10,600, and the first destruction, which is 7,500 before 9,600 BC, gives us around 17,100 BC for the very first destruction. Interestingly, this does align with geological episodes, we could say, if not catastrophes. So we have a rapid sea level rise event known as Meltwater Pulse 19 Ka, also known as Meltwater Pulse 1A0, 1A naught. And again, this is 19 Ka, so 19,000 years ago, which would be 17,000 BC. And again, Edgar Cayce gives the first destruction of Atlantis at 17,100 BC. So we're only a century off dealing with such large timescales. I'd say that's pretty remarkable, honestly. We already talked about how Meltwater Pulse 1b corresponds with a glacial outburst flood at the end of the Younger Dryas, and also corresponds with Plato's date for the destruction of Atlantis, right around 9,500 BC. So that's our third destruction. So we've got our first destruction around 17,100 BC, aligned with Meltwater Pulse 19 Ka. And we've got our third one around 9,500 BC, aligned with the glacial outburst flood and Meltwater Pulse 1b. As far as the second destruction, Cayce gives the date, a date range, it seems, of 10,700 to 10,600 BC, which lines up very closely with the hypothesized Younger Dryas impact. So this is a theory that the Younger Dryas cool period was initiated by an airburst or comet impact around 10,800 BC. And the idea is that it ejected material into the atmosphere which blocked out the sun, causing a cooling effect, kind of like a nuclear winter. It also aligns with the disappearance of the Clovis Paleo-Indian culture, right around 10,800 BC also, very close to that same date. So the Clovis culture was very widespread and very uniform throughout North America, and then all of a sudden it fractures and splits into a lot of regional, localized tool-making traditions. So it's very uniform, very widespread, and then it fractures and gets regionalized. This study is showing many independent studies have reproduced evidence of an impact or airburst at dozens of Younger Dryas sites. So they have geological evidence in shock quartz and melt glass and things like that, and particularly this black mat layer all throughout the northern hemisphere, which attests to this impact or airburst that kicked off the Younger Dryas cooling period and potentially spelled the end of the age of Clovis. And again, this overlaps pretty closely with the second destruction as given by Cayce, around 10,700, 10,600 BC. So Cayce gives us one other date, which is relevant. He's saying that Atlantean priests came to Giza in 10,500 BC, and they constructed pyramids and record chambers. And they sealed these record chambers only to be opened when certain souls, I suppose, returned into materiality, right? So certain people reincarnated. Very interesting, but he's saying that these Atlantean priests came over, right? And they made a record of their race, of their history, of their laws, and of their religion to be sealed at Giza and only to be opened at a specific time in the future, which seems to be sometime in modernity. And this is the hall of records that people talk about under the paw of the Sphinx. So this is what people are referring to when they talk about that. He also does mention King Ararat, which is interesting. We have Mount Ararat in near the Caucasus, which is where Noah was fabled to have landed, which is just a little interesting aside. But yeah, so he's saying Atlantean priests came over to Giza, constructed the monuments there, and sealed a record chamber at that time, at 10,500 BC. So Robert Schoch is a Yale-educated geologist, and he's found evidence of water erosion in the enclosure of the Great Sphinx. These are from Robert Schoch's website. On the right, he's showing wind erosion, and on the left, rain erosion. So you can see they're very distinct. And he argues that the only time that there would have been enough rain to produce this amount of erosion on the Giza Plateau would have been during the African humid period, which was about 12,600 BC to around 3,000 BC. Now, to accumulate this amount of erosion, this would have had to have been constructed thousands of years before the end of the African humid period. So we're talking the Sphinx is thousands of years older than 3000 BC. And supposedly, by the mainstream paradigm, it was constructed by the dynastic Egyptians around 2500, 2400 BC or so. But he's saying it has to date at least millennia older than that, just based on the erosion and the fact that the climate has been dry since 3000 BC. Now, Robert Schoch also worked with Robert Bauval, who came up with the Orion Correlation theory, and they actually wrote a book together and did some work together. But the Orion Correlation theory by Robert Bauval states that the monuments of Giza are a kind of date stamp referring to this 10,500 BC date. And he's claiming that the 3 stars of Orion's belt line up with the Great Pyramids at 10,500 BC on the spring equinox, and that the Sphinx, which is always facing due east, so the Sphinx is always facing the spring equinox because the spring equinox is due east, but that specifically the Sphinx would be facing its astronomical counterpart, the constellation Leo, during the age of Leo, when that spring equinox is happening against the backdrop of Leo, right? So this would have been 10,500 BC when the Sphinx is gazing at its astronomical counterpart on the spring equinox. So again, this is during the age of Leo, 10,500 BC, which is due to the precession of the equinoxes. So we'll cycle through all these ages over a 25,000, 26,000 period. That's the precessional cycle. And they're saying that these monuments essentially provide a match to the heavens in 10,500 BC. All right, that's the Orion Correlation theory. So again, these are the dates summed up from Edgar Cayce. This is some archaeological and geological events. So 23,000 to 20,000 BC, we have the start of the Ibero-Maurusian culture, the Solutrean culture, and the start of pre-Clovis settlement in North America relevant to the Solutrean hypothesis. Based on these 3 cultures and their association with Atlantis. You know, they're in the right place at the right time. I would say by this time, if not earlier, Atlantis has been settled, right? Because we already have that transatlantic connection at this time. The first destruction of Atlantis, as given by Edgar Cayce, is 17,100 BC, which lines up very closely with the sea level rise of meltwater pulse 19 Ka at 17,000 BC. Then around 13,000 BC, we have these haplogroups splitting. QL804 splits from QM3. One is just in Europe, one is in Central America. And we also have the spread of haplogroups U, H, and V into Africa and Europe from the west. Now, 13,000 BC, this could be right around the time of meltwater pulse 1A, so another sea level rise event, as well as the start of the African humid period. So perhaps these population changes, the population split, as well as the movement of these haplogroups, could be due to, one, increased sea level rise, causing the maritime island-based empire of Atlantis to maybe seek refuge elsewhere. Maybe the coastal settlements were leaving for the continental interior. And the start of the African humid period might have made the African continent be more attractive to settle, right? So it'll be more humid, more desirable place to live in, easier to live in. Around 11,050 BC, we have the Clovis culture started, whose end lines up pretty closely to the Younger Dryas impact. And again, this date also lines up with pretty close to what Edgar Cayce gives as the second destruction of Atlantis. And this might be more of like a prolonged episode. So that's around 10,700 BC or so. 10,500 BC, we have the priests of Atlantis coming over, completing the constructions at Giza, sealing the record chambers at Giza. Also lines up with the age of Leo and the Orion Correlation theory. 9,600, 9,500 BC, we have the invasion and war of Atlantis and the subsequent third destruction. We also have Proto-Athens founding, or ethnogenesis at this time, simultaneous to the start of the war pretty much. We looked at, in the last video, perhaps the start of the war was related to this founding for some reason, you know, because they're so close in time. And also due to the myths about the contest between Athena and Poseidon for the founding of Athens. Then in the Egypt video, we looked at the Edfu texts, where Horus's reign started in 8,600, 8,500 BC. And the Edfu texts are talking about him reclaiming Atlantis, it sounds like. So after the flood has ebbed, the Shebtu thrust back the flood, and the four crews of Horus arrive at the round arrival site, the primeval island site. And Plato's dialogues also give this as the date for the founding or ethnogenesis of the Proto-Cayce, right? So the fact that those two dates line up is pretty interesting. And because the latest time that we have any gene flow potentially from Atlantis would be 7,000 BC, right? So we have these maternal haplogroups coming in as early as 13,000 BC in waves, but the last wave would have been done by 7,000 BC. As we saw in the first video, this is evidenced by the young branch of haplogroup U5B1b that's shared by Berbers of North Africa and the Sami of Scandinavia. So that's the latest date that we have this genetic connection, which might imply Atlantis. And then a few hundred years later, in 6200 BC, by this time we have, more sea level rise. We have the Storega slide. Doggerland and Sundaland are sinking or sunken by this time. So based on the fact that there's no longer gene flow out of Atlantis, and based on the fact that These other continental shelves are also sinking, Doggerland and Sundaland. I would say by this time, Atlantis is probably gone for good. Okay, so that is a sum of the timeline so far based on Edgar Cayce's dates given, his dates for the 3 destructions of Atlantis, and also looking at archaeological and geological dates as well. So thank you guys for watching.